Cabernet tends to be the sort of Errol Flynn of the grape varieties.
One of Australia's leading beer judges.
People always ask, how do you get involved in sake and how does that connect to music?
Because wine is an adventure.
Conventional winemakers who just condemn all natural wine as faulty.
The prestigious title of Sake Samurai.
Looking at whiskey in more of an artful culinary way.
The difference between getting good quality fresh hops, it just translates straight through into the beer.
This is the Drinks Adventures podcast. I'm James Atkinson, and this is the show where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and uncover trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Hi again, everyone. Our guest this episode of the Drinks Adventures podcast is Max Allen, a Melbourne-based journalist and author who has been writing about drinks for more than 25 years. Max is the wine and drinks columnist for the Australian Financial Review, a long-time contributor to Gourmet Traveller Magazine, and the Australian correspondent for jancisrobinson.com. And we actually discussed that website with Jancis herself when she joined us on the podcast back in Season 4. I've long been a fan of Max's writing, so I was excited to learn about his latest book, which is called Intoxicating, 10 Drinks That Shaped Australia. Max joined me on the show to discuss this personal journey through Australia's colourful and complex drinking history. And that conversation is coming up in just a moment. Now, I'm no brewer or distiller, but I have a fair few friends in the industry who are, and I know where they go to source the ingredients they need to make the wonderful beers and spirits that we all enjoy drinking. I'm talking, of course, about Bintani. With experts in all categories on the team, Bintani understands how brewing and distilling ingredients work together like no other supplier. Bintani handpicks the best. Max Allen, thanks so much for joining us on the Drinks Adventures podcast.
Great to be here.
Now, this book, obviously a tremendous amount of research has gone into it. It looks like a book that has sort of been bubbling away for quite some years now.
It's been bubbling away for longer than I was comfortable with, to be honest with you. I actually started planning a book about the history of alcohol in Australia, 15 years ago, more, and was beaten by the project because it was just too big. It's a huge topic. And so I kind of let it slide and worked on other things for a while. And in the meantime, somebody else wrote that book anyway. There was a book called Under the Influence, which came out about 11 years ago, which is a history of, a straight history of alcohol in Australia. And then about 4 years ago, I just had the idea of focusing on a small number of drinks and telling those stories rather than telling like the whole story, which is huge. I thought a good way into it would just be to focus on a small number of drinks that had some kind of relevance to me, and that would be a good way of telling a snapshot of the history, if you like.
I'm sure that, as you say in your book, in the first chapter, a lot of people are going to be very surprised to learn of the Indigenous history of making fermented beverages. How did you come across this sort of unknown history?
That was actually the other reason why the book seemed like something that was worth tackling again, because I'd found research by Maggie Brady, who's an anthropologist at the ANU in Canberra, and she'd uncovered a number of examples in the historic literature of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people drinking fermented drinks prior to European arrival in 1788. And that just absolutely blew my mind. It was, so counter to what I'd grown up thinking about history. And I thought, well, there's the first chapter. If I can find a drink to write about from that history, then that's the first chapter of a history of drinking in Australia that immediately offers something new. So all the work that's in there about Indigenous fermentation, I've really, found from people like Maggie Brady and doing some research and finding other examples. And I'd also been really interested in the use of Indigenous ingredients in drinks making now. So the use of native botanicals in spirits and vermouth and bitters and things like that, but also people using native grain to make beer and whiskey. And I thought, well, that's the end of the book. That's what's happening now. And I've got the beginning of the book, which is the history. So I just need to find a few drinks to fill in the middle bit.
Maybe you could just give listeners a bit of an idea of some of these Indigenous beverages that you uncovered in the book.
So the drink that really piqued my interest and set me on this path was the Tasmanian Cider Gum. It's a tree that grows in the frost plains in Tasmania. So it needs cold. It loves cold. So it's a really location-specific tree. And there are historical records of Europeans in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s travelling through the central highlands of Tasmania up around the Miena region, the lakes and the Central Plateau. And they witnessed Aboriginal people drinking the sap or the exudate of the cider gum tree, not only fresh, but also Aboriginal people would leave this drink to pool in the hollows in the tree and cover it in stones and come back when it had naturally fermented. And there are records of people drinking this drink, and there's one quote that says, and it was intoxicating. That's one of the reasons why we call the book Intoxicating, because it comes from that original record. And I just thought that was fascinating. I thought, well, I have to taste this for a start. So I travelled to Tasmania and tasted the sap of the cider gum tree in a frost plain on Aboriginal-owned land in Tasmania. And that became the beginning of the book, because I thought it was a magical experience, because it really made you feel connected to generations and generations of people who've lived on that land and drunk this incredible tasting drink.
And what did it taste like?
I can see the cider reference. I've had it a couple of times, and the first time I had it when somebody brought a sample over to Melbourne, you can see that apple acidity in it. You can taste that fresh, lemony apple cider. It's very mild. It would be about only 2 or 3% alcohol, maybe a little bit more, depending on, how long it's been fermenting. But it had this, there was also some bits of, so this sap, it's a very light, it's like a light sugar syrup. So when you run your finger along the syrup oozing out of the tree, it only trickles out in a very small quantity. And you run your finger along this syrup line, and the breeze kind of catches the syrup and whisks it away into the air. It's that kind of consistency, but it's got this lemony flavour. But if it's been trickling down the tree for a while, it also picks up some of the flavour of the wood as well. So it's quite a complex tasting, refreshing drink. You could see why people would taste this and want to taste it again. It's got none of the eucalyptus flavour you'd expect to see in eucalyptus sap or something coming out of a eucalyptus tree.
And it could only be made from this specific variety of gum.
Exactly right. And it's only really seems to flow in any meaningful way. And we're really only talking, we're not talking like a maple tree where you can get a bucket full in a relatively short amount of time. It's not something that is likely to be commercialised, because it's just the quantity is not there. And it's also appears to be very climate specific. So I know people have tried planting it in other parts of Tasmania and on the mainland, and it just doesn't perform the same way, if you know what I mean. Wine people talk about terroir, this sense of the environment influencing the flavour of a drink. Well, you can't get much more terroir specific than a drink that comes from a tree that only grows in one place.
Why do you think this important part of Australia's history was lost?
I think part of it is that early European settlers, explorers, entrepreneurs that travelled this country looking for things to exploit or to commercialise, they were looking at it through European eyes. So one of the indigenous intoxicants, and there are a few, that was explored quite heavily was pituri from the central Australia. So down around southwest Queensland, around Batuta, the Channel country down there, and into the desert. There's a native tobacco is what it's described as. And that was explored quite heavily because, of course, the commercial prospects of finding a source of mildly intoxicating tobacco in Australia was very attractive. When people found some of these indigenous drinks, I believe they worked out that they couldn't make a huge amount of money from them because, as I say, they were very seasonal. They were not abundant. Nobody thought about cultivating the kind of Banksias, not that you need to because they grow everywhere, to make a fermented Banksia nectar drink. But also I think a lot of these drinks were very mild. They were much weaker than the strong alcohol that Europeans brought with them in the 18th century, and therefore wouldn't have had the same kind of appeal as the rum and the spirits that they already had.
You relay some pretty incredible statistics in the book, namely that when the first fleet arrived in Australia, it was carrying 54,000 litres of rum. Now, what would that rum have actually tasted like?
Well, when you picture that history, what kind of rum do you see in your flavour, your flavour mind?
I suppose my reference points go back as far as Bundaberg in Australia, and that's about it.
And that always did for me too. I thought when the rum rebellion, everybody knows about the rum rebellion and the kind of rum that was being used as currency in Port Jackson in the early 19th century, I imagined it was that kind of golden molasses-based rum too. But when you look into the history, you think, well, actually the first fleet arrived in 1788, they stocked up on what they called rum in Rio on the way. And of course, that wasn't molasses-based rum at all. It was sugarcane rum, much more like what we now know as cachaça, but was called aguardente, which is burning water or burnt water. And there are accounts from those early settlers of how bloody awful this stuff tasted. You know, we had this romantic image, I think, of people arriving in this new colony and toasting the king or whatever with golden Bundy-style rum, but actually it was probably a kind of pale, rough firewater that had been aged in pretty rank barrels for God knows how long on the journey. One of the things that really drove me with this book is trying to imagine what these things tasted like at the time. And that rank burning water image just really kind of adds a layer of, I don't know, discomfort to that history, which, you know, just changes the way you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that early rum, is that what they still would have been drinking when rum evolved to actually become something of a currency in Australia?
Well, the first rum that we automatically think of as being typical Australian rum wasn't really being produced until much, much later in the 19th century, into the 1880s, after the sugarcane industry had been established up there in Queensland and northern New South Wales. So for most of the first decades of the colony, all the rum was imported, and some of it came from the West Indies, but a lot of it came from India. It was Bengal rum, which is probably more like arak, and it's the arak flavour. So it was made from, in many cases, probably a blend of molasses perhaps, but also palm sugar. So again, that changes the flavour profile of what you expect those drinks to taste like. It's a rougher, lighter-bodied, coarser flavoured drink.
And it doesn't sound quite good enough that I'd be happy to accept it as my salary, to be honest.
No, that's right. Well, you know, beggars can't be choosers really in that situation, I don't think.
I guess so. And who knew that Australia had an early tradition of making peach cider?
Isn't that a great story? So in 1803, 1805, there was such a glut of peaches in Sydney that the government encouraged people to ferment the peaches to make peach cider. That's C-Y-D-E-R, using the old 18th century spelling. And so there's a lovely ad in one of the newspapers saying that the governor will award for the best hogshead of peach cider made by the colonists this year. He will award a cow in return for the finest tasting peach cider. But of course, peach cider in Sydney, middle of summer, no refrigeration, it's going to go off pretty quickly, which is exactly what happened. So people started distilling it in an attempt to kind of preserve the alcohol and keep it from spoiling. And a couple of weeks later, the same newspaper was saying anybody discovered distilling, which was illegal, will be fined or thrown into jail or whipped or whatever the punishment was. So that encapsulates for me that kind of attitude in early Sydney, this kind of two-faced, double-edged attitude to encouraging people to drink mild drinks as a kind of civilizing influence, and then this almost immediate punishment for indulging too much in ardent spirits. Like there are these two parallel attitudes to drinking in Australia, which I think we've still got today. That foundation was there in early Sydney.
How would you say that sort of attitude is still prevalent today?
I think on the one hand, we love the fact that we have a modern, mature, cosmopolitan attitude to alcohol. You know, we love our wineries. Look at how the outpouring of support and community and spirit that happened just earlier this year when, you know, wine regions were affected by bushfires and drought, when regional breweries and cellar doors and distilleries have had to close because of the pandemic. We feel very connected to our sensible consumption of alcohol. And we love the fact that we can, it's an absolutely booming industry, this, cellar door visiting weekends in local regions. And we feel kind of really upset when we can't do that. And yet at the same time, take the New South Wales or Sydney lockdowns over the last few years, this attitude to, yes, but you can't drink too much. We need to crack down on this wanton overindulgence in alcohol, which leads to awful violence in our inner cities and other communities. And yet at the same time, that same government is handing out licenses, for 3,000 person drinking barns. So there's this kind of dichotomy between how much we support alcohol and sanction it and accept it as part of everyday life, and yet at the same time tax it heavily and bring in rigid rules about when we can consume alcohol and when we can't. So it's a really difficult relationship that we have with alcohol, that you can see the strands of that relationship kind of stretching back through these historical stories.
Now, you detail in the book your authentic rendition of this 19th century peach hogwash. Tell me about how that went.
Well, I read these accounts of what this stuff tastes like, and I just think the only way you can get to try that is to make it yourself. One of the things about the peach cider that was a real kind of lesson for me is that as a lover of real cider made from nothing but apples, or pear cider made from nothing but pears, perry, it's really given me the shits how many people in Australia have been using any old fruit to make a beverage and calling it cider. You've probably seen them, you've probably written about them, you've probably spoken about them. There was a winery a couple of years ago that produced a sparkling alcoholic grape-based beverage, which in my book is wine, and yet called it grape cider because they thought they'd be able to pick up a few more, sales from it. And I thought, well, that's just ridiculous. That's cynical marketing. And then I came across this story of peach cider in the early 19th century, and I just thought, well, I'm wrong then, aren't I? There is a 200 and something year tradition of making a drink out of anything but apples and calling it cider. So I went to the Queen Vic Market on a busy Saturday around lunchtime when I knew I'd be able to get a few trays of peach seconds in the middle of summer, brought them home, crushed them up, put them in a basket press, got the nectar out of them, put them in a demijohn and just left them. Now, I didn't have an old hogshead like a 19th century recipe that I found told me to use, but I had some glass demijohns. I just left it, let it do its own thing. It fermented naturally. It tasted pretty good to start off with. It tasted like peaches. It was delicious. And then the wild yeasts and the bacteria took over, and it ended up tasting exactly like a contemporary account of the time said, which is, as you pointed out, it was just hogwash. It was disgusting. It just, it was too warm. The lactic bacteria had really got stuck in and produced I don't know this, I didn't test anything. I'm just assuming based on past experience, this is what happened. And it had all the faults under the sun, right? It was volatile. It was mousy. That yeasty, lingering taste of mouse piss on sawdust that you get at the back of your throat in a mousy drink. It was just disgusting. So I thought, well, I'll do what they did. And I took it to Seb Rayburn and we distilled it.
And that was at the Craft & Co. in Collingwood?
Yeah, when Seb was there. So using their little, I think is it a 5 or 10 litre still? It's only a tiny little still, their test still. Their alembic, a copper alembic, which pretty much exactly like it would have been designed and made 120 years ago. And we distilled it. And that was an absolute revelation because I've tasted raw spirit straight out of the still in Scotland and America and other places and here. And, it's a great experience visiting a distillery and tasting raw spirit. But when it's something you've seen from fruit to fermented cider, and then you see the fractions of the flavours drip out of that still. And it's like the distillation takes apart the rainbow of flavours, bad and good, in the drink and delivers them in single colours. And seeing all of those colours, some of which were foul and some of which were quite good. And then at the heart of the distillation, there was this just the most pure, singing, beautiful essence of peach. You can see why people call it the spirit of life or the water of life, this almost alchemical distillation of the essence of something, the spirit of something. And you read those words and you understand them, but when you see it and taste it for yourself and you see the magic, it really gives you an amazing appreciation for the process of distillation. I'm sure you've had that experience too, where you see one thing transformed into another. It's magic.
This episode of Drinks Adventures is supported by Fever Tree Premium Mixers, the mixer of choice in the world's best bars and restaurants. Right now, I'm enjoying Fever Tree's smoky ginger ale as the perfect accompaniment to some of my favourite bourbons and whiskies. Now we move along to wine, more specifically champagne. Now tell me about the significance of the 1841 wreckage of the William Salthouse ship in Port Phillip Bay.
Yeah, the William Salthouse. This is a story. You said at the beginning the idea for writing this book has been bubbling away because I've been writing about some of these stories for so long. One of the first stories I wrote about in the mid-90s, 94 I think it was a tasting of Shipwreck champagne. So in 1841, the William Salthouse, a ship had come from Montreal in Canada, and it was breaking an intercolonial trading ban, and it was bringing with it to the young settlement of Melbourne supplies. Most of those supplies were building supplies and food, but it also had these wicker baskets full of fine champagne on board. And I just think that really encapsulated what was happening in Melbourne at the time. It was a struggling town, and yet people were really prepared to pay above the odds for this luxury drink. Estate agents were giving it away for free at land sales on the banks of the Yarra at exactly the same time that the ship sank. And then 150 years later, some of the bottles that were rescued from the bottom of Port Phillip Bay were opened and tasted by a group of winemakers, and the head blender of Moet et Chandon Champagne was in town at the time. And I remember writing about this story for The Age Epicure as one of the first stories I wrote at the time. And I think that experience of tasting this drink that had been sitting on the bottom of the bay for 150 years, and it was mostly like warm oyster juice. It was pretty disgusting, but you could tell through that oyster juice flavour, you could tell that the golden wine in it, you could taste it. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why this book exists, is that having that experience of literally tasting history fires up the imagination. It was a really great experience.
Do we know much about what that champagne actually was?
The shape of the bottles and the branding on the cork, which you could still see. This is 1841 that this ship went down. So the wine itself was probably if it was a vintage, it would have been at 5 years previous. So it's a wine from the 1830s. The shape of the bottle and the name on the cork fairly conclusively made the researchers think it was from a champagne house called Gourmet, which still...
I've actually been there, funnily enough.
Well, there you go. So They were really proud of the fact that this connection had been made, and they still ship wine to Australia today. I've got a number of memories of drinking Gourmet champagne on special occasions here in Melbourne before I knew about this and subsequently. And so we also know that at that time in the 1830s, it was probably sweeter, a lot sweeter than champagne that we are used to today. That was very much the taste at the time. It wasn't until the 1870s, 1880s that the taste for dry champagne really started to come in Melbourne. So yes, it was a sweet champagne from Gourmet in the town of Eye. So that adds another layer of attraction to that history, I suppose.
Now, you make the point in your book that Henry Lindemann and Christopher Penfold were both doctors. I think many people might be surprised to learn of the close links between wine and therapeutic medicine in the early years.
Not just wine. One of the funny things about this is that I've become a bit of a collector of old bottles. I already was a bit of a kind of nerd with that beforehand. I moved into an old house many years ago, and there were some bottles under the shed, and everybody's had that experience of finding old bottles in the garden or in junk shops or whatever. But one of the most amazing old bottles that I found in the process of research was an old bottle of Seppelt's Angostura bitters. Bitters were at vermouth, bitters, cordials, those kind of things. The Lindemann's company, the Penfold's company, the Seppelt company, all those big old wine companies produced these tonics in the early 19th century. It was the same time that Abbotsford Invalid Stout, which is still with us today, was developed. Guinness, the most famous stout in the world, was marketed from the very beginning as being good for you, as a healthful beverage. You don't have to go back very far into the early 20th century to see that so many drinks companies were founded by doctors, as you say, and drinks were being sold on their healthful properties, to cure flatulence and that kind of thing. I've drunk that Seppelt Angostura bitters a few times because the bottle I found was remarkably full and the bitters tasted like they were made yesterday. It's an incredible, vivid taste of history again. And I've tried it a few times and I can just report that it doesn't actually cure flatulence. And why I thought that was a really interesting chapter to write is that we're seeing the same kind of marketing is coming back with us today, even though there are pretty clear codes about how alcohol is not meant to be marketed in Australia these days. You can't come out with an ad like Guinness is good for you. You can't sell alcohol like that anymore. And goes back to what we were talking about before about this kind of double standard, this two-headed approach or this double-sided approach to alcohol. But you do see so many new drinks coming out now with cleverly worded, purported benefits to you from drinking it. The new hard seltzer trend of what is basically alcoholic water with fewer calories and less stuff in it that is being absolutely targeted at the wellness-oriented consumer. There's the cannabis gin that I write about in the book that's made with elements that have been extracted from cannabis that are being sold pretty explicitly for their healthful properties. So one of the themes that I just keep coming back to in the book and just generally is the more things change, the more they stay the same. How many trends that we're seeing in drinks in 2020 are actually nothing new, that they've been around for a very long time.
Are you aware of Impression Gin by any chance?
No, I haven't come across that one.
This came out last year and I've got the blurb in front of me. Unlike any other gin, Impression Gin is infused with locally sourced natural antioxidants like dandelion, mangosteen and calendula, high in collagen, and kakadu plum packed with vitamin C. This is gin with benefits because life is all about making the best impression.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And just yesterday or the day before, as we're speaking right now, yet another celebrity has launched her own wine brand in the US, Cameron Diaz, and it's being billed as a, quote, clean wine. What does that mean? Does that mean that other wines are dirty and therefore impure and full of nasties? So you read the blurb, and apart from it being made from organic grapes, it's pretty conventional. They actually explicitly say in their marketing that Cameron Diaz started looking into it and was appalled by how many nasties are used in wine production. And she's marketing it as this clean wine. And again, it's all about preying on this idea that if you're going to drink, you need to do it healthfully. Whereas you and I know that the potency of the 14% or 40% alcohol is way more potentially damaging than any of the other things that are actually in the drink.
Yeah, I think there's got to be a better way of getting your antioxidants and vitamin C than drinking gin.
I think there has, yeah.
Now, Dalwood Cabernet may not be as familiar to folks at home as something like Penfolds Grange. What was so important about that wine in Australian wine history?
When I was putting the book together, I thought, okay, I want to limit it to 10 or a dozen drinks that I can really focus on. So peach cider, for example, we spoke about before, is the name of that chapter. The chapter is actually about homebrew. So I talk about the tej, the Ethiopian mead that is made in Ethiopian communities in Melbourne and elsewhere in Australia. I talk about the cider I make in my backyard, and this whole notion that every migrant culture that drinks brings with it its drinks culture, and they make drinks at home. So that chapter is not all about peach cider, but it is about the concept of making your own alcohol. So I needed to find a wine that told the story of Australian wine. So a single wine that would kind of be the way into that much bigger story. And Grange is the obvious choice, right? But I thought, well, Grange, everybody knows the story anyway, certainly in the wine industry. It's very obvious, and I wanted to do something that was less obvious. And I thought about that wine, Dalwood 1930 Cabernet Sauvignon Petit Verdot. And it's a story that I've been really intrigued by for many, many years, because in 1930, James Devoren, an old winemaker at Dalwood Vineyard in the Hunter Valley north of Sydney, made that wine at a time when nobody was really drinking that kind of wine. So why was he making that in the first place? He made it from grapevines that were first planted at that vineyard in 1828. So that vineyard goes right back to the beginning of Australian wine. And when he made that wine. Nobody wanted it at the time, so it was shipped off to the UK. That tells you a story about what was happening in Australian wine in the 1930. And then 30 years later, Max Lake, who was a surgeon, a wine judge, he was fascinated by wine. He tasted that 1930 Cabernet Petit Verdot blend, and he loved it so much that it inspired him to plant his own vineyard in the Hunter Valley, Lakes Folly, which is regarded as one of the first, if not the first, certainly the first high-profile boutique winery in the 60s that inspired dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of other people to plant boutique vineyards, doctors, lawyers, TV producers, that kind of thing. And then Dalwood became Wyndham Estate, which was one of the big popular wineries in the 70s. It was bought by Pernod Ricard, so there's the story of corporate ownership of the wine industry. And then about 4 years ago, it went back into private hands. So that vineyard, that single place in Australia, straddles the whole history of Australian wine, just one place. And that wine in 1930 is kind of in the middle of that history. And that wine influenced so much of what came afterwards. So I thought, what a perfect intro into the whole history of Australian wine that can be told through the story of just one place. And when you go there, you can sit on the veranda of the original owner's house that was built by convicts in the 1830s and 40s. And you can look at the vineyard and you can feel that history still present in the land. It was a really amazing experience to do that. And that's why I chose that wine for that story.
Now, you say in the book that you developed a newfound respect for Victoria Bitter. Why was that?
Yeah, so what I said before about how Grange was the obvious choice for wine, so I wanted to find something that people wouldn't know about. I thought about using VB as the story for beer because I know that a lot of people who've read what I've written over the last 25 years about big company beers would be probably quite surprised that I'd chosen VB because I'm not CUB's biggest fan. On the whole, I've been very critical of that brewery's approach to marketing its products over the years. I don't particularly like a lot of the beers, and I've said that. I'm quite open about that. I certainly don't drink them very often, but I thought VB has a huge place in my own personal drinking history, you know. So I remember drinking it a lot when I was younger. I remember family drinking it when I was too young to drink. When I worked in bottle shops, VB was, you know, such a huge part of what we sold. And I've been driving through and drinking in and going to parties in Richmond and Abbotsford and that kind of area for almost 30 years. So anybody who knows that part of Melbourne knows how important that huge brewery is to the landscape of that place. So I thought it'd be really great to just get inside the Abbotsford brewery and watch how VB is made. That's what I wanted to do. And they actually came back with the idea of saying, well, how would you like to spend a day brewing it? Now, bearing in mind that I wanted to use each of these stories as a way of telling a bigger story of Australian beer, I thought, well, that's beautiful. You know, I'll get to taste the malt. I'll get to taste the famous Pride of Ringwood hop in its pure form. I'll get to hopefully see the famous CUB yeast that they've been propagating and keeping going since the 1920s, I think, isn't it? Up close and personal. What a fabulous idea. What I didn't realise is that going in and doing all that made me realise what a quintessentially Australian beer it is, VB. You know, it's easy to dismiss. I sound a bit like I've come out as a CUB ambassador. Maybe I have a little bit, because it's pretty impressive what they've done. You know, it's all Australian malt. The Pride of Ringwood hop was developed in Ringwood in the 1950s, so it's an Australian hop. And the yeast that they've got, originally, yes, it came from Carlsberg, but it's got a unique character now, obviously, after being here for so long. And I think you put those three major ingredients together with the local water, of course, which is less important in terms of flavour, and you do create a uniquely Australian beer. So regardless of whether you actually think it's any good or not, it doesn't really matter, because the flavour profile is uniquely Australian. I think we talk about that a lot in wine. We talk about it increasingly in craft. Spirits producers are all over this idea of producing drinks with uniquely Australian flavour profiles. And VB's kind of been there, done that. And I don't know whether you've been into the sensory evaluation unit there and how unbelievably hard they work and how proud they are of maintaining that flavour profile, which again, you might not like, but you've got to give them respect for bloody maintaining it. That was a really great day.
I wonder whether, now that you're in closer contact with CUB, whether you've been able to get it through to them that the apples fall off the tree in autumn rather than spring.
That's my next project.
We're talking, of course, about Little Green Cider there. You took umbrage at the marketing on that particular product of theirs.
And that's what I was saying. When you write that kind of thing in a national newspaper and then you turn around a couple of months later and say, oh, by the way, can I come in behind the scenes and can you show me the VB recipe, please? Can you share with me your, most precious intellectual property? The fact that they actually even talked to me, I was quite surprised.
It's sort of funny that aspect of the product isn't really reflected that much in the kind of marketing that we see with VB.
That probably is an indication of how little other people care about the kind of things that I care about. This is actually, to be honest with you, is a concern with the book. I'm thinking, are other people going to be as fascinated with trying to recreate a 19th century peach cider? That's what I live for. I love that stuff. And it's pretty geeky and it's pretty nerdy and, it's a niche thing. So I think the people who market VB are much better at marketing than me. They've probably done their research that emphasising the uniquely Australian quality of the Pride of Ringwood hop is not going to play well with their core demographic. I don't know. Maybe they will. Maybe it's something that they will look at now. I don't doubt it.
Now, I didn't realise the extent to which Australian wine was a laughing stock in Britain, say, 50 years ago.
Oh, but you've heard that Monty Python sketch, haven't you, about Perth Pink and
Shadow Chunder? I had, but it was a distant memory, to be honest. Your book kind of refreshed that a bit for me.
What I didn't realise is it wasn't a joke. It was just basic reportage. That sketch came out, I think it was the early 70s. So if people haven't heard it, it's worth checking out online. The Monty Python Australian wine sketch is pretty easy to find. And it's just a litany of what you would think ridiculous Australian wine names like Chateau Chunder and Perth Pink and I can't remember the others. Yet it was actually based on real brands. So there was a Wallaby White, there was a Bondi Bleach, Bondi Bleach. No, that can't be right. And the most famous one, Kangarooge. And I'd heard about this. I'd seen bottles, on documentaries and things. And I thought, well, that's a fascinating history. The fact that there were Australian wines being sold in the UK in the 1970s called Kangarooge, how did that happen? Where did we come from? How did Australia go from being the most important wine export country to the UK in the 1930s, where huge quantities of so-called port and sherry and sweet white were being exported to the UK. Everybody knew Australian wine in the 1930s. And then in the 1970s, it's kind of being just treated as a joke. And I saw Oz Clarke, the English wine writer, with a bottle of Kangarooge on a documentary called, funnily enough, Chateau Chunder, which was about the history of Australian wine and its relationship to the UK. And I was in the UK last year and got in touch with Oz, who I've known for a number of years, and said, you don't fancy opening that bottle of Kangarooge, do you? And we'll drink it and we'll talk about the history, because Oz was really instrumental in promoting wine in the UK in the 1980s and 90s. And I said, yeah, sure. So I went over to Oz's place and he opened that bottle of Kangarooge and it was bloody, spoilers, it was bloody awful. But we opened some other nice bottles and we had a great chat about the history. But it is fascinating to see that roller coaster and history repeating itself, how in the 80s, 70s and 80s, early 80s, Kangarooge, Australia was a joke. Then Australia became hugely popular in the UK. And now a lot of the English people think Australian wine is just cheap brands with marsupials on the label again. And there's even another Kangarooge that you can buy now that's being sold in Sweden.
Really?
Yeah.
Under that name?
Yeah, so you can buy litre boxes of Australian Shiraz in Swedish supermarkets called Kangarooge. So honestly, this idea that history repeats, it literally does.
Now, the final chapter, obviously I was very well aware of the use of native ingredients in distilling, for example, and some beers as well, but you also had a go at making wine from native grapes, I believe.
Yeah.
What grapes are native to Australia?
So going right back to the beginning of this conversation, where this book came from was having this idea of writing of alcohol, history of drinking in Australia, and having that first chapter, the historical examples of fermented drinks enjoyed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people before Europeans arrived. And the final chapter was inspired by a Yuin man from southern New South Wales, Noel Butler, who approached me at Rootstock, the wine and food festival in Sydney, about 5 years ago. And the first thing he said to me was, why has nobody made wine from native grapes? Or do you think you could make wine from native grapes? And I thought, well, first of all, I said, what do you mean native grapes? I didn't know there were any grapes that were native to Australia. I mean, I knew there was some grape-like fruit, but there is a particular fruit that is called the native grape that grows in the bush around where Noel is near Ulladulla. And so it was his invitation to pursue that idea that I thought, well, that would make a great last chapter to the book, as well as being a really, really interesting thing to pursue. So I went to visit him and his partner Trish in the bush near Ulladulla. Gosh, when was that? That was 2 years ago now. And we went out and we harvested some of these berries, which do look a hell of a lot like Cabernet or Shiraz grapes. They're remarkably similar to grapes. You can see where they got their name from. They don't taste like wine grapes and they don't have as much juice as wine grapes, which meant that they didn't actually make wine. As in, when you squash them up, they don't release enough juice to make a liquid that the yeast can ferment the sugar in. They form a kind of squidgy mass. But if you put these grapes to other uses, you can make other drinks that are potentially quite interesting and flavoursome. So that, I thought, would be a really interesting way to finish the book, because that's about potential. That's about where do we go from here? How do we look at the last 200 and whatever it is, years of the history of alcohol in Australia and look at all these lessons, all these stories, and maybe put them to some kind of use to produce a drink that is uniquely Australian, but is produced in a responsible and considerate way. I think that's what that last chapter's about.
Do you think we're already starting to see that happening?
I think we're absolutely beginning to see that happening. And the conversations that are being had right now in the wake of everything that's happened this year, from the bushfires through to the pandemic, through to the Black Lives Matter movement, I think there are so many questions being had right now about how we want our drinks community and how we want our culture of drinking to be in the future. It goes back to what we were saying before. I think it's been really interesting to see how the communities have pulled together in response to this kind of rolling litany of crises they've been subjected to since the beginning of the year. So I think there's some really interesting questions being asked at the moment about where we go to from here, yeah.
Tell me about some of the drinks to try at home, you know, the sherry cobbler and these other ancient Australian drinks. How did you uncover those, and what are the chances that these could be the hip new thing in small bars around Australia?
Well, some of them already have been. So at one point, this was going to be 12 drinks, not 10. Can't remember what the other one was. But one of the chapters was going to be about cocktails and mixed drinks. And one of the reasons why that didn't happen is that I couldn't find a single drink that I wanted to focus on because there were so many options. But also I couldn't really find the narrative that I hope is in each of the other chapters. So I thought, let's put some of those cocktail stories or mixed drink stories in as kind of, little interludes in between the chapters. So the first one is the Blow My Skull, which is a fabulous punch, really, a mixed drink that was developed by a crazy governor in Tasmania in the early 19th century. And it's a ridiculous mix of, I can't remember offhand, rum and porter and brandy and God knows what. And it's just potent and powerful. But actually, we made it and it's actually quite delicious. And we run through that old bottle collecting thing that I have. I found an empty bottle of Yalumba Niblick, which is a pre-mixed white lady cocktail in a hexagonal Art Deco bottle that acts as a shaker, that was released in the 1930s. And I just think that's fascinating, this history repeats idea. We're all looking at pre-mixed cocktails, particularly in this pandemic time when all those bars have been shut and have been forced to make pre-bottled cocktails. But actually that tradition dates back to the 1850s in Australia. And things like the Japanese slipper. I was told by Seb at Bad Frankie Bar that the Japanese slipper was the only Australian invented cocktail that was on the International Bartenders Association list of approved cocktails. It's no longer there, unfortunately. So I tracked down the guy that made it and spoke to him about it, spoke to him about the history. That was a great experience to kind of get from the horse's mouth, if you like, the history of one of those iconic 80s cocktails. So those cocktails are meant to be fun, but also they're delivering some history as well that you can actually literally recreate at home.
Now, do you think any of some of the drinks that you touch on in the book, for example, fortified wine or brandy, which have got such a rich history in Australia, could ever come back into fashion in our lifetimes? Because obviously we've seen in the last 10 years the comeback that gin has had. And I just look at some of those really unfashionable drinks and wonder whether they could follow a similar trajectory.
I think brandy at a smaller bar level is doing okay. I think it's still got a long way to go to catch up with certainly the white spirits in terms of retail, but I don't see why not. I mean, as you say, the history of brandy in Australia, I could have gone into much more detail. Maybe the next book, 10 more drinks that shaped Australia. Brandy will get more of a look in because it deserves it. It has an amazing history and the brandies themselves are fabulous. You know, there's some amazing old spirits out there. Fortified wine, I'm not so sure, but never say never. I mean, fortified wine, I think, has so much emotional and historical baggage, partly because of the legacy of the flagon of port, you know. It is seen as a cheap form of alcohol that is associated with people who misuse alcohol. So I think that's going to be really hard to get over. And also, it is strong. There is a very strong wellness trend that we are witnessing that is people are looking for lower alcohol options, and trying to sell them a fortified wine that's 18 or 20% is tough in that environment, no matter how organic or clean it might be.
Max, it's been an absolutely fascinating chat. Congratulations on the book. I can tell the amount of research that's gone into it, and that narrative in each chapter that you talk about absolutely is there. So I hope Drinks Adventures listeners will go out and buy it.
Thank you very much.
Where can people find it, actually? That's a good point to make. And where, as the author, where would you prefer them to purchase it from?
Hopefully all good bookshops from mid-July. So, you know, by the end of July, hopefully everywhere. Booktopia, the usual online outlets. I know that Books for Cooks are very strong supporters. And if you haven't been to Books for Cooks yet, check them out anyway. If you're remotely interested in drink and food literature, then they're better stocked than anybody. And also, I don't know whether it'll be set up by the time this plays, but I might be able to sell directly through my website, maxallen.com.au. But any of those outlets, it all helps.
Fantastic, Max. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at @ByJamesAtkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.